Welcome to Virtual Insights, Objects of Desire. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Persephone Allen, and I'm the manager of adult public programs at the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. As many of you know AFAM, our museum is dedicated to expanding the appreciation and understanding of self-taught art across time and place. And this year we celebrate 6 decades of this work with our institution's 60th anniversary. Tonight's panel is inspired by our current exhibition, BRUT Collection Bruno Decharme Compagnie, which features photographs by more than 40 self-taught artists that present radically different ways of seeing and being seen, and which you can now visit at our galleries and of course, purchase the catalog online. We are immensely grateful for opportunities like this to connect together online, which would not be possible without your support. Know that if you enjoy today's program, you can also donate to sustain ongoing virtual experiences like this one, our 60th milestone, and all of the amazing events we've organized this spring, which we hope you'll also be joining us for. As we tune in from our homes this evening, we want to begin by acknowledging that our museum stands upon the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples, and we honor members of this nation, past, present, and future. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge and express our gratitude for all of the healthcare workers continuing to combat the ongoing pandemic in our communities and around the world. Tonight, we explore questions of photography and how lens-based artists have visualized desire, intimacy, sexuality, and gender expansiveness, looking closely at images from the BRUT exhibition and beyond that offer us depictions at times suggestive, unnerving, or explicit. We're thrilled to be joined by incredible curators Brian Wallis, Joel Smith, and Nelson Santos, who will unpack photos from the exhibition and beyond, contextualizing this work within broader photo histories and contemporary photography. We'll begin with brief introductions, followed by presentations from each of our speakers and a moderated discussion before closing with Q&A. We invite you to share questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, and we'll make every effort to respond to as many of these questions as possible at the end of the discussion. Closed captioning in English is available for today's program by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and a program recording the panel will also be made available to watch online at a later date. To begin with our first speaker, I'm pleased to introduce Brian Wallis, writer, curator, and historian of photography. He is currently curator of the Walther Collection, New York, Ulm, where he has organized a series of exhibitions on vernacular photography. He was previously deputy director and chief curator at the International Center of Photography in New York, and he is an author and editor of numerous books, including Imagining Everyday Life, Engagements with Vernacular Photography, published in 2020, Weegee, Murder is My Business, published in 2012, and Miroslav Tiki, published in 2010, among others. His essay for the BRUT exhibition, The Shape of Desire, also provided inspiration for this evening's conversation. Joel Smith is the Richard L. Menschel Curator of the Morgan Library and Museum, where his many exhibitions have included Illusions of the Photographer Dwayne Michaels at the Morgan, organized in 2019, Peter Hujar, Speed of Life, organized in 2017, and A Collective Invention, Photographs at Play, organized in 2014. Previously, he served as the Peter C. Bunnell Curator of Photography at the Princeton University Art Museum and the Fisher Curator at the Francis Loeb Art Center at Vassar College. His many publications include Edward Steichen, The Early Years, Steinberg at the New Yorker, The Life and Death of Buildings on Photography and Time, and Peter Hujar, Speed of Life. And finally, Nelson Santos is an artist, curator, and consultant advocating for artists and working with nonprofit organizations to produce mission-driven exhibitions, public programs, artist projects, and publications. He served as the interim director of the curatorial programs at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art from 2019 to 2020, and director of visual aids from 2000 to 2017, where he launched an online registry to support and preserve the work of HIV+ artists, established a curatorial residency for the research of art and cultural history around HIV/AIDS, and also organized an international film screening for Day Without Art, as well as conceiving of Duets, an ongoing publication series pairing artists, activists, and writers in dialogue about their creative practices and social justice. For Stonewall's 50th anniversary in 2019, he curated Y'all Better Quiet Down at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art. He is currently board president of Queer Art, a nonprofit arts organization supporting LGBTQ+ artists across disciplines and generations. Thank you all so much for spending your Tuesday evenings with us. We're really honored to have the three of you here this evening, and thank you to everyone on this call for sharing virtual space. At this point, I'd like to invite Brian to begin.
Thank you, Persephone. I hope all of you will at some point have a chance to see the exhibition Photo BRUT. It's important for many reasons, but the one that's most significant to me is that it brings to light creative work by marginalized makers. Like all outsider artists, these producers are unconventional and often untrained. But what is more, they are all in some ways, in this case, using photography, the easiest and most accessible visual medium. But what really interests me is the fact that they're not professional artists, but rather homegrown practitioners with a popular visual language that is readily accessible, though not often examined. In a word, they are hobbyists. So it is useful to see these works in a broader context of vernacular creative practices, such as family snapshots, scrapbooks, homemade albums, objects made for private pleasure. Unlike the institutionalized patience that Jean Dubuffet first sought out when he formulated the concept of art brut in the 1950s, these outsider artists using photography are less deviants and social outcasts than amateurs, cleverly adopting various forms of vernacular photography and mass media collage to express their ideas about gender and sexuality. Could I have the first slide? As a case in point, I want to look briefly at 4 individuals highlighted in this exhibition: Morton Bartlett, Eugene Von Branchenheim, the Type 42 photographer, and Miroslav Tiki. Although quite different from one another, these 4 artists share several characteristics. Most prominently, they made images of white women and girls, presumably from the perspective of straight white males. Each made an extensive archive focusing on this female imagery. Tiki, for example, made over 5,000 photographs. Von Branchenheim made 3,000 images. The Type 42 photographer made over 900 Polaroids, and Bartlett left behind at least 200 portraits. The scale and ambition of these outsider endeavors hints at what may be their most distinctive feature: the compulsive drive to recreate the experience of desire through amassing discrete archives of sexual imagery. Very little is known about the lives of these artists or their motives in creating these substantial bodies of work, but we do know that they were, for the most part, socially isolated. None of these artists exhibited their creations publicly. So rather than ascribe biographical or psychological motives to their works, I would like to consider these works together within the context of a wider visual culture produced under historically specific conditions. These works were all a product of a 30-year period in mid-century Euro-American culture, from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, when softcore sexualized imagery was published and widely available commercially, principally for white, straight male consumers. As such, the artistic products of these artists, eccentric as they may be, conform to contemporary visual culture around sexuality and gender more than they contested it. Could I have the next slide? Sometime during the 1940s and 1950s, Morton Bartlett, who was a professional designer and commercial photographer in Boston, fashioned at least 15 half-sized dolls of adolescent girls and boys. Utilizing his own costumes and study setups, Bartlett made over 200 color photographs of these dolls in surprisingly animated poses. Bartlett paid careful attention to constructing with his dolls a catalog of poses, facial expressions, hairstyles, and clothes, many of which he fashioned himself. Sometimes he photographed the dolls without their clothes. Some of the photographs are unsettling in their blatant intimations of childhood sexuality. We know little of Bartlett's views on this subject. In one public statement in 1957, however, Bartlett stated, "My hobby is sculpting in plaster. Its purpose is that of all hobbies, to let out urges that do not find expression in other channels." Bartlett did not specify what urges he was referring to, but his focus on the hobby aspect aligns his work with what historian Lisa Siegel has called homemade pornography. Homemade pornography, that is the crafting of mildly titillating and privately circulated objects relating in some way to human sexuality. In a recent book, The People's Porn, A History of Handmade Pornography in America, Siegel argues that there is a nearly lost history of such erotic objects fashioned by people across America from the 1830s to the 1970s who drew, painted, glued, sewed, and baked their own pornography. Some objects, such as images of nude women fashioned from ivory by whalers, or images of pinups on the sides of World War II bombers, responded publicly to existing imagery with handmade versions. Others, like the homemade studio photographs made by Bartlett, create surprising, even shocking images for private purposes, whatever those may have been. Bartlett may have described his project as a hobby because in the 1940s and 50s, the visual exploration of novel ideas about sexuality and gender in the privacy of one's home could still have invited public scrutiny or even legal challenges. Can I have the next slide, please? Pinups, Playboy magazines, and other forms of mid-century commercial pornography were the clumsy mass cultural formats that most directly employed photography to represent scenes of sexuality and seduction. This softcore pornography aimed to make that which is private and secret fully visible and explicit, generally for the purpose of some sort of sexual arousal. Given the ubiquity of this quasi-pornographic imagery and the ways its catalog of provocative poses and staged allure infiltrated 20th century commercial advertising, it is not surprising that many outsider artists adopted its styles and iconography, often using collage and direct copying to make clear that these were appropriated concepts. Next slide, please. Chicago artist Eugene Von Branchenheim mimed the aesthetics of contemporary pinup photography at home when he made thousands of staged images of his wife Marie posed naked or in other glamorous outfits in a variety of feminine roles, from exotic seductress to glamorous star. In these images, Marie posed coquettishly against floral backdrops, nude or wrapped in shimmering fabric and adorned in flowers, pearls, and handmade ceramic crowns, conflating erotic desire with femininity and nature. Next slide, please. Von Branchenheim sometimes focused fetishistically on details of Marie's hands or legs. He meant his photographs of Marie to represent woman in general. Such homemade photographic inventories emulate the ways that gender roles are socially constructed and deconstructed through repetition, fragmentation, and reiteration. Next slide, please. Theorists have long argued that gender is a construction and a social performance. So it is worth considering precisely how and in what context such enactments of these roles have been staged for the camera through highly organized series, typologies, and taxonomies. In the case of the so-called Type 42 photographer shown here, this unknown archivist compiled an inventory of over 900 Polaroid photographs of television appearances by female actresses and movie stars from the late 1960s and early 1970s. Next slide, please. Most of these photographs are carefully inscribed with the name of the actress and sometimes the name of the film or even her body measurements. This catalog of female roles encompasses the entire range of filmic culture, from low-budget sci-fi to blockbuster studio films, and includes such stars as Doris Day, Elizabeth Taylor, Barbara Streisand, and Raquel Welch. Next slide, please. Collectively, these works serve as a catalog of a range of looks or styles for feminine roles. In many, the women are seen in moments of panic or distress, cast in vulnerable and often sexually suggestive positions for a presumably heterosexual male viewer. The production of this homemade archive of gendered imagery was facilitated in the second half of the 20th century, not only by the mass medium of television, but also by the widespread availability of inexpensive cameras and instant film, such as the Polaroid Type 42. Next slide, please. All of the thousands of scratched and blurred photographs by the Czech artist Miroslav Tiki from the early 1970s focus on a single subject, women. In Tiki's case, these were all females he observed in his hometown of Kyiv, Czechoslovakia. These women and girls were photographed going about their daily business. They were observed from a distance without their knowing, as if under surveillance. While there is a strong element of voyeurism in this approach, what seems to have engaged Tiki's dogged obsession was instead a curious archival project to record the everyday movements and poses of these women, often focusing on details of their hands, feet, shoes, crossed knees, as if carefully examining each gesture for its own specific revelations. Next slide, please. Tiki was trained at a prominent art academy, but he prided himself on being an amateur in photography. He made his own cameras from cardboard and plastic. He developed his own film, deliberately badly. In photography, the format of the amateur is the snapshot, and this is the style that Tiki aimed toward. But he accentuated all the characteristics of snapshots that for most of the amateur snap shooters, that most amateur snap shooters avoid: the double exposure, the blurred image, the bad cropping, the misfired shot, the blotchy printing. Indeed, one might argue that Tiki's photographs are really anti-snapshots. They deny everything that conventional personal photography strives for: clarity, composition, family, perfection. Tiki preferred mistakes. The photographs he took in his strolls around Kyiv were not documentary street photographs or artistic views, but like snapshots, casually framed images of people encountered on the street. They were often literally shot from the hip, as Tiki aimed his camera without looking through a viewfinder. For the most part, Tiki eschewed the direct gaze, the personal connection, or the highly individual relationship implied in many snapshots. Next slide, please. What distinguishes Tiki's photographs is their frequent focus on inconsequential details or gestures. Numerous images look at details of shoes, ankles, crossed legs or knees, gestures of greeting or intimacy, a woman getting out of a car or adjusting her handbag. These meticulously observed moments may suggest small recognitions of tenderness or emotion, or they may in themselves have little significance. But taken together, they begin to create a kind of lexicon of everyday communication that is scarcely ever recorded or understood. And far from being a fetishist ogling, these acute observations demonstrate Tiki's great reverence for the intimate lives of the women he observed, understanding and appreciating them from afar. In focusing on women, next slide, please. In focusing on women, Tiki looked less at sexualized imagery than at certain categories or types of ritual events, as is characteristic of certain amateur photography practices. In Tiki's case, however, these rituals, shopping, strolling, sunbathing, or having lunch in the park, are not the typical signposts of domestic representation. Similarly, when he represents collective activities, another staple subject of amateur photography, he opts for spontaneous rather than formal group events, such as girls playing soccer or just laughing together for no apparent reason. The lack of reason, or the just or justification is a key aspect that links Tiki to both the surrealist and to the everyday snapshot photographer. The suspension of meaning, the mystery of the everyday is what catalyzes these photographs. Next slide, please. Although these four artists avoid any overt representations of sexual acts or anything that might be deemed obscene, their adoption of a sort of homemade pornography seems at times to embody a predatory gaze or voyeuristic approach that is at times extremely unsettling. In fact, what seems to me evident in these works is a sublimation of sexual desire through representation, a substitution of the image for the act. The construction of elaborate archives of vernacular photography seems to me, in the case of these four artists, neither metaphysical nor cosmic, but simply practical and encyclopedic. Echoing the predominantly heterosexist and largely puritanical cultures in which they operated, these artists suggested through the repetition and accumulation of images the impossibility of capturing fleeting reality and the elusiveness of feelings. By repeatedly returning to the imaging of sexual desire, which no single photograph could capture, these archives point to the pauses, the spaces in between, the invisible, that which cannot be photographed, as the most apt metaphor for constantly deferred sexual gratification.
Is that over to me, Brian?
Yes, Joel?
Okay. Let's move to the next slide, please, which is blank. Hello, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. I was really struck by a comment that Bruno Decharme makes in the wonderful interview at the start of the catalog, Decharme being the central collector in putting all of this work together. I think it's very beautifully put in explaining his term photo brut, which of course is derived from the term art brut, but it's a very different kind of phrase because art can be brut because art normally is not. Photography is a medium. It's not a metaphysical realm as art is. And so it's not, it doesn't get affected by the word brut the same way that art does. And Decharme does a very good job, I think, of being non-reductive in the way that he makes sense of brutness as a photographic quality. He says, most of these artists are concerned not with making something good in whatever sense one uses the word, but with providing evidence of a vision. And he goes on a little later. In other words, art brut is not situated in the register of symbolic representation that defines art. In my view, that is what makes it radically different. I think this is beautifully put, and what I'm going to try to do in talking about the work of Peter Hujar in relation to some of the work in the show and some of the work that Brian has just talked about, is to suggest that the condition that Decharme defines as central to photo brut is not a yes, no, either you have it or you don't condition, but a continuum. The privacy or the publicity of the artist, the extent to which the work that's made by the photographer is for public understanding or is for one's own obsessions, is something that exists in many different forms. And Hujar makes a really compelling case of somebody who wanted and really tried to bring these qualities together, to make art that was about truly intimate concerns and yet to give that art a public. Can I have the first slide, please? Outsider, in other words, is something that might be seen as having many different meanings and degrees. Some outsider artists are hermetically cut off from social life and social communication by disability of one kind or another, by a mental situation or condition. At another extreme, some put their work forward, but do not advance into the mainstream despite their best efforts. Through the nature of their work, let's say, or by the way that they promote it, or some combination of the two, which I think is the case with Hujar. And a third option is that the artist belongs to whatever degree, a subculture or a counterculture that fills in for the general world of the public that might have been addressed. Rather than belonging to the mainstream, one embraces one's singularity and outsiderness and finds a community willing to do the same. The result in all cases is an art of unusually intimate address. It's art that is not for everyone. And that is the factor that we see celebrated in this exhibition. Hujar's mature career began in 1973 when he was 38 years old. And it's the year that he moved into the loft at 12th Street and 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, where he would live and work until his death at age 53 in 1987. And he was chiefly a portraitist. And socially, culturally, Hujar was inside so many scenes. He knew the worlds of music, of drag performance, of art, of literature, but temperamentally, he was incurably a perpetual outsider. And this came together, these two qualities, the inside and the outside, in the photographs he made in his studio, portraits that are about intimate encounter. That is really the crucial factor in his work, I feel. His subjects were those, to a great extent, willing to reveal themselves in his studio in a way that they would not be expected to do elsewhere, often on a sexual basis, such as the bar dancer TC, who was somebody Hujar knew from the neighborhood and with whom he had sex before making this portrait and a variant on it that's a little better known. That was the action that created the kind of intimacy that made it possible to make the portrait Hujar wanted to. Next slide, please. Likewise, Bruce de St. Croix, who Hujar met in a laundromat in the neighborhood, had performed as a dancer, and he reflected later about this famous photograph of him, that he had been a dancer before. He had been a performer following the directions of a director. And in this case, the dance was to be a young nude man with an erection, and that is what he did in the photograph. It's not, I think, a pornographic image in any familiar sense of the word, well, in some familiar senses of the word, but the most powerful thing about the picture is the sense of intimate allowance that is made between the image maker and the subject. Next slide, please. His subjects were also people who knew that he would celebrate and not make freakishness of their distinction, their difference. For example, Greer Langton, whom he photographs here a couple of years after her gender reassignment surgery, in a way that completely complements the kind of transformation that she had lived for, and addresses her as the person that she is, sees her in the glamorous light, and yet at the same time in the with the integrity of photographic vision. You can understand the complexity of the person in front of you, not in a reduced kind of way, but unfolding in it over the course of several portraits that he makes. These are two of the images from that setting. Finally, next slide, please. Hujar was constantly concerned to explore the ambiguousness, the fluidity of sex and of sexuality. For example, in making this reclining nude that's in a pose very often associated with a portrait of a woman, but in close encounter with the photograph, you can see that it is an image of a man. What you're looking at is a beautiful and sexually compelling individual, and it's not about gender difference in the end at all. It's about the flow sort of from one register to another as you experience the picture. Next slide, please. The photographs that Hujar made on the piers, which I'll address now, explore a range of positions that are more public than the privacy of his studio work. They're about some of the same psychological concerns that I've just talked about, but they frankly position themselves in this public realm. And I want to cite 3 moments or modes in the work that he does on the piers. This being the work that he does in public that is also about sexual encounter. This is a photograph made in 1976, not far off from the time that he made the image that I just showed. They're related in the type of sexual appeal that they're about, but this is about sex existing under the full light of the sun on Easter Sunday, 1976, which is the day Hujar makes this picture. And now I'd like to show you the contact sheet, one of the contact sheets from this session. Next slide, please. These are images of cruising, but it's cruising not as a private or furtive sort of experience, but quite ebulliently public. Hujar is specifically, I think, making a point of being in public and the existence of this scene in the wide open light of day. So this is 1976 on the Christopher Street pier. And what I want to do now is look at the work that he does in some of the interior piers in the years that follow this. The work on the piers begins here in the outdoor conditions of Christopher Street, but then it changes and the content of the work changes. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, this is a photograph that comes directly out of that contact sheet that we just saw. So this is work that he does complete in the form of exhibition prints. Next slide, please. 1979, Hujar is photographing in the sex pier. It's an interior space lit by light from outside. This is himself and another individual inside that space. And this is work of a different kind in the sense that very little of this does he ever print and make a part of his publicly exhibited work. Much more commonly, it's something that is a part of the kind of private practice that you would expect somebody following a relatively private obsession, like Morton Bartlett, for example. And it is annexed to the work that he does in his studio. It is also related to the work that he does out in the public, but it is something of a different creature. Next slide, please. And in the 1980s, in collaboration often with his very important friend, the artist David Wojnarowicz, who you see at the bottom left in the 1981 contact sheet, Hujar begins to photograph the art scene that begins to arise in some of the piers. On the left, he's photographing Wojnarowicz and a mural that he's painted on the Canal Street pier. And on the right, Kim Jones doing a Mudman performance in the piers. Photographed doing a performance that would not be consumed by any viewers except those who ventured into that space were it not for Hujar's photographs and the photographs of others who photographed there. What he's doing is realizing this as a space that is a whole separate world. And it becomes a public world through his photography of it. And it ceases to be, for him, a place of sexual encounter and becomes something that's sort of an art world. Next slide, please. This is a print that comes out of that work. Again, he's returned to producing final prints out of this work and coming psychologically much closer to the work that he produces in his studio. It's about the same sort of experiences of psychological solitude. Next slide, please, which is blank. What I want to suggest, I'm aware how far outside of the specific concerns of the exhibition, these meditations are, what I want to suggest is that we as viewers interpret the bruteness of brute photographers in part because of what we know or what we imagine or how we imagine their social or psychological or aesthetic isolation works. But we don't know. And it's a matter of our projection to a great extent with so many of these individuals, how we make a sense, make a vision, in Decharme's term, out of what it is they produce and the extent to which we understand it as being art or not being art. What I want to propose is that an exhibition of this kind is really important because it allows us to be aware of this continuum from the public to the private in the work of anybody who's using photography, which is itself, I think, inherently an industrial and therefore a public and a social medium. It's something that we're aware of as part of the world of the printed page and of the pictures that we share with one another. And yet there is a space for privacy within it. In fact, much of post-war photographic art is about expressing some form of alienation from, or difference or distance or distinction from the mainstream that is implied by straight photography. What we ask ourselves, I think, without knowing that we're doing so, is the alienation I'm seeing knowing or is it oblivious? Is the intimacy of a dress that I'm experiencing in this photograph artistic, or is it, at another extreme, medical? Next slide, please. Without knowing who makes the picture or exactly what the picture is for, it's easy to see an association among these four photographs, and yet two of them are made by an absolutely canonical photographic artist of the last 4 decades, and the other by one of the artists in the exhibition. Next slide, please. Once we're aware that the work on the left is by Stephen Shore and the work on the right is by Elizabeth Van Vieve and is part of photography that she makes within this specific prescribed space, we begin to interpret their actions differently and the pictures differently. And yet it's something that is not contained in the pictures that leads us to those interpretations. It's something that points to the continuum that I'm trying to suggest this show brings into full sight. Next slide, please. Likewise, photographs that make a strangeness of the subject, that turn the portrait condition into a performance of a kind, that call into question the subjectivity of the person in the image, is something that is not specific to photo brute conditions, but is a part of many bodies of important photographic work. Next slide, please. We're seeing on the left the work of Ralph Eugene Meatyard, and on the right a work by Marcel Basculard from the exhibition. I don't mean by any means to undercut the singularity of what Basculard does in having the villagers in his community photograph him in these situations, or to suggest that what he's doing is really parallel with what somebody like Meatyard does, but rather to suggest that our perception of each of these artists could open out onto our perception of the other. And through the commonality of their photographic practice, we can begin to see the ways in which they potentially share concerns. Next slide, please. Finally, these are works in which the artist makes an object of himself. At the left, an artist photographing his self-portraits as a part of the environment in which he lives. And on the right, the artist involved in a kind of miniature architectural structure that becomes the props for his work. Next slide, please. The images on the left are by Ray Johnson, made in the last 3 years of his life in his community on Long Island, and on the right by Alexander Lobanov from the exhibition. Johnson, perhaps even more than any of the artists I've mentioned, including Hujar, really brings up the question to what extent we're seeing the articulation of isolation and to what extent we're seeing something that's a symptom. To what extent photography gives us access because of this miraculous image-making power that Brian alluded to of photography, the ease with which an image, a vision in Decharme's term, can be expressed through photography. Because of that, it's easy to jump either to the conclusion that the artist knows entirely what they're up to, or to the assumption that they're simply pushing the button and exhibiting a symptom. What I want to propose and what I hope is a question people can keep alive as they go through the show is that this exhibition gives us a chance to understand photographs that we see all the time in a very different way, and to appreciate the intimacy of photographic address in a different way than we have been accustomed to doing. Over to you, Nelson.
Great, thank you so much, Joel, and thank you, Brian. I mean, that's you both give us so much to think about already. Before we begin, I also had some slides I wanted to share, so maybe we could just move to the first image. I just wanted to bring in some artists into the room who are not in the show, but whose work I believe are related to this exhibition and to this talk. I did have the privilege of seeing the show this weekend at the Folk Art Museum. It's an amazing show, so I do recommend everyone go if possible. And I appreciate the way that the museum selected and organized the work in the show from a collection that Brian mentioned was, or tangentially mentioned, comes from a very white Eurocentric, American Eurocentric male-based collection. And so I just wanted to bring in some others into this discussion. Just to be clear, I mean, I don't want to discount or not acknowledge the 4 women in the show, and there's 6 artists of color in the show, including some really beautiful pieces by Steve Ashby. But like many institution exhibitions, there's always room for a critical eye of who's not there at the time. And I find that particularly important in a show that is about sort of the marginalizing of artists to start with. I just wanted to bring a few Black queer self-taught artists just into this discussion. And I wanted to start with Alvin Baltrap. Some people might be familiar with his work already. Alvin was born in 1948 and moved to the Bronx with his mother at a very young age, and was given a camera in his early teens and started photographing then. So like everyone we're speaking of is a self-taught photographer, artist. He did join the Navy in 1969 and took his camera and photographed there and set up a little darkroom. And so his portraiture photography, at least the works that are available to see, seem to really start at that time. And they portray often men of color, sometimes, often with a queer eye, though not necessarily a queer subject. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Alvin is also probably best known for his photographs of the piers as well. So for those who are not familiar with the piers, because I know there's people, you know, calling in or listening in from many different areas. The piers on the West Side Highway of New York at the time were the original shipping docks. And then they started to fall apart. And as they fell apart, they became sort of both a cruising ground. They also just became a place for sunbathing. So a large, diverse group of queer men who had no other sort of safe place to go would go there. Though I also don't want it to necessarily make it sound like it was a safe place, because there were gay bashings and murders there as well, and even holes in the piers that people had fallen through. So we do sometimes like to, or some of us like to look at the piers with a little sort of more nostalgic eye. But it was a tough area, but it was this place that Alvin Baltrap would also go to as well. And at first he would go with a little bit of a distance photographing. One of the things I think is interesting about his photographs of the piers is he does photograph primarily individuals of color, though he does photograph others as well too. But something you don't see in too many other pictures of the piers, though you do see that in Hujar. Next image, please. So again, he photographed, sort of documented what was just going on at the piers, cruising at the piers. Next slide, please. But he also developed relationships with people there as well too. So he would speak to individuals and photograph them, ask them to pose, and create sort of a whole story around individuals. Next slide, please. He continued to do this work. He developed everything himself and printed his own images. He printed them very small, mostly 5x7. Most of these works were done between 75 and 86. Sorry, it says 73 to 86. They weren't really ever shown. He tried to show occasionally, but really did not get much traction there. Baltrap passed away in 2004, and Douglas Crimp, the critic Douglas Crimp, wrote about him and his work, which brought him some more recognition. And a few years ago, his work was shown at the Bronx Museum in New York. Next slide, please. So the next artist I'd like to talk about is Frederick Weston, another self-taught artist. Fred was born in 1946 in Detroit, Michigan. He came to New York in the 1970s. He came to New York to become a fashion designer, and had other fashion designer friends, and they collaborated a lot, but facing a lot of discrimination. They really did not get their looks very widely done. They self-produced items. One of the things that I remember Fred would tell me a lot when guys started wearing shorts with tights, when that became a thing in New York, like, you know, at the gym and beyond that, he was like, I was designing that in the 70s. So I always feel like he was someone who was ahead of his time. And this is a self-portrait that was done in Times Square. Can I have the next image, please? His favorite medium, or one of his favorite mediums, was actually the photocopy machine. So he would go to like a Kinko's at the time and use the copier, or use one at somewhere where he was working. And this particular piece, called Nobly Nude, was an image that he saw of a Black African-American man, a slave, that was in a textbook. And he was really taken by the individual's gaze. And so he photocopied the image several times, and then altered the image, and created hundreds of these. He also wrote a poem to this piece called Nobly Nude, because Fred was multi-talented and was also a poet and performance artist. Next image, please. One of his other ongoing series was called Blue Bathroom Blues. And he would do multiple collages. He would often choose a color to collage in, and the color was very important to him. It really set a feeling or a tone. But the Blue Bathroom Blues series was very much based on all the blue that's in our bathroom. He was taken by like all of the labels on shampoo bottles, or I can see one for Scott's tissue there, or the medicine he was taking, and how blue is used both as this sort of like calming place, but the bathroom is also about this cleansing place. And so he did hundreds of these as well too, and also has a beautiful poem called Blue Bathroom Blues as well. Next image. One of his other ongoing collage projects was these body maps, where he would outline his body or have someone outline his body for him. And then he would create these collages in his life-size body. And this body map, it's all African-American men collaged onto his body. And the images come from magazines and advertisement and wherever he can find things. But he did create them with different topics. There's some that have celebrities on top of them. There's some that have animals. There's one that turns into a mermaid. But I also wanted to point out the binders that are in the bottom, which is the way this installation of this show, which had happened at Gorban Robichaud Gallery, used the binders that he collected. Can I have the next image, please? So this is an image of his apartment. So again, you can see all of the binders there. And the binders are just a collection of all of the images that he's collected. He collects them from magazines and such, and then he would label them. I can't quite see the ones on the screen, but some of them say are a binder that is just feelings, a binder that's police, binder that's bedroom, binders by colors. So there's a blue binder, a yellow binder. There's one that says fruit on it. And so whenever he's working on a piece, he would pull out these binders and create a work. So the image, the blue image above, of course, is his as well too. And then there's scraps of other smaller pieces as well. And he would say that the compulsion to work is linked to his compulsion to collect. He openly, he was open about the fact that he was, would go to Hoarders Anonymous, that he would keep a very large collection of items and had to keep that under control, but he also, it was also an incredibly organized archive at the same time. Next image, please. And then this is the last image I have of Fred. Fred sadly passed away last year of cancer in 2020. I got to know Fred through visual aids when I was working there, and Fred often credited visual aids as the organization that recognized him as an artist. At the time, in about the 90s, he took his fashion portfolio that people weren't responding to, and he would go to construction sites and tape them or tack them up into the construction site. And then he would also tack items that people could take away, like sticks of gum or Q-tips and such. So he created his own kind of like outdoor performance installation happening. And then that was, he was doing that when someone from visual aids asked him what he was, what he was doing, and told him that he was an artist, not just a designer, and then that really got him thinking of himself as working as an artist. He's holding a self-portrait, obviously. He did several of these with different, one covered with medication, etc. And then this one is called I'm Here Somewhere. Next image, please. And the last artist I wanted to speak to or speak about is Zach Creer. He is a younger self-taught artist born in 1984 in San Francisco, California. Many of the artists in the exhibition are of a certain age or certain generation. We tend to, I feel like there's this tendency to look at outsider artists after they're no longer with us, but there are still lots of self-taught artists still out there. And sometimes we have to open up the definition of what an outsider or self-taught artist is. So Zach Creer does these drawings on found images. This one, for example, is an image of David Wojnarowicz taken by Peter Hujar. And he uses a reproduction of that image and does these tattoo drawings on top of these images. Next image, please. And he gets these images from different sources. So from magazines, from pornography, from other artists that he admires. And again, he uses the skin as the canvas to do his drawings on top of. Next image. The drawing often remains on the actual skin itself. Other times it extends beyond that and becomes a border or a decoration around the image itself. This is another found vintage image. I do like, though, that it looks like it could have been possibly from the piers. And the next image. And this is the last image I have, and it's a drawing on top of Keith Haring and Juan Du Bois, Keith Haring's boyfriend, that was originally from a Polaroid taken by Andy Warhol. And he often will use this whiting out of the eyes on the image as well too. I know we were running a little bit long, so that's my last image of the three artists I wanted to speak to, and I think we can now just move into conversation mode. Great, and are we all unmuted?
Yep.
Great. All right, so thank you again for your beautiful presentations. I think what we're going to do is 15 to 20 minutes of a conversation. I would love this to sort of flow as naturally as we can between the three of us, but I do have some questions to start with, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So the first thing that I was thinking about is about photography's power of portraying and revealing intimacy, desire, and sexuality, a way that other mediums often can't. And also photography's way of doing that both private and publicly, which you've both spoke to. But I'm wondering, how do you think the artists that you spoke of, how their methods, their intentions, and their relationships to their subjects influence or reveal the way that we then see or interpret that work? And this either one of you could start if you have any thoughts.
So,
It's very different in Hujar's case than it is from the artists in the show. It's maybe the most extreme difference imaginable between those with whom he achieved this concerted intimacy and those who, somebody like Tiki, for example, who evinces zero interest in getting to know the people in the picture. The frisson seems to come from the privacy of the situation, if anything, the undiscovered nature of the photographer. But with Hujar, I mean, the biggest difference of all, I guess I have to say, is that he's an extremely studied and informed photographer. He knows exactly what he's doing with the camera, and we don't have the evidence anyway that anybody in the exhibition has that relationship to the medium. They have very compelling relationships to photography, but it's not the relationship of an expert craftsman with the camera. And I think Hujar was about training that craftsmanship towards intimacy rather than allowing it to become a barrier. That kind of sleek practice that we're familiar with from magazine photography, in which he would have been perfectly happy to do in a magazine context, is something that he really wanted to turn into the basis of psychological connection.
And Brian, you talked a little bit about that, those ideas of public and private there, how those images were not necessarily intended for public, but they have since become public. So how do you think that that affects the way we read the work?
yeah, this is a big issue, particularly pertaining to all sorts of vernacular photography, but other kinds of vernacular productions. To take what is basically a private and therefore deliberately intimate process and present it in a public forum inevitably changes the meaning of it. But that might be a necessary evil in order for us to begin to understand and focus on these kinds of private practices, rather than simply and repeatedly valorizing, publicly acknowledged artists and professionals. So I love that aspect of the show, that that most of these artists and practitioners in the exhibition were working privately, or even are working privately, without much recognition, satisfied with the work itself as an end in itself. And to me, that accords with a lot of vernacular, even vernacular sexualized imagery that we have today, online and on our cell phones and so forth. This is a very intimate kind of communication that takes place in an overtly public forum. And so I think these questions of public and private are now becoming mediated. And that's really where one of the interesting critical questions lies, how to develop these private profiles of identity in public forums.
Do you think, what do you think that, this is for both of you, what ethical issues, if any, do you think that these bring up? And do you, especially, in a sort of Me Too kind of time frame, and just a more of a recognition of who has the sense of power or not, it's do the sort of subversive or the unintended images. I'm sorry, I'm forming the question here as I speak. But does the responsibility here, the ethics or the responsibility here, does it lie on the artist, or does it lie maybe on the institution who then chooses to show the work, or possibly the collector, if the works were maybe not necessarily intended for public view? Or is this not an ethical issue? Is art outside of that?
I think it is, but institutions can be perfectly clear about the fact that they're hybrid creatures. I mean, in the case of you don't even need to go as far as it being the work of people who were creating art in some mindset that we have no way to directly access. But even an artist like Vivian Maier, for example, whose work was not known, she becomes the co-artist with the institutions that bring the art to the fore and put it out there. That's just the way that that this works on a public level. And museums, publishers, certainly people on the web are co-authors, they're co-creators, they're broadcasters, and turning things that are private into publicly accessible art.
I would just add that, dealing with vernacular photography, for instance, personal snapshots or photographs or photo albums, things of that nature, these are obviously, very private. At one point, somehow got dislodged from their originary or family connections and floated out into the, bloodstream of the internet or the flea market or whatever, and end up in galleries, museums, or private collections, and inevitably take on a different sort of meaning. I think this is the kind of recontextualization that Joel is talking about. The presenting context inevitably and always changes the meaning of what is represented. But in that context, I again assert that you have the opportunity for a new critical reconsideration of the work. So it might not just be a personal or family document, but it might represent a larger historical, social, or political meaning.
So along those lines, thinking of like Tichý's work, for example, and this goes to a longer history of photography about sort of being the voyeur, and like what beyond sort of like the image of a voyeuristic image, is there a tension between voyeurism and other concerns of the photographs? Like even to the extent of like privacy or exploitation, or any of those concerns that you feel either not necessarily come up in this exhibition, but in that kind of work in general that you
Sure. I think that's always a concern with photography, which is implicitly voyeuristic medium. But in the case of someone like any of the four photographers that I mentioned, there are real complicated questions about ethics and privacy. And is Tiki a stalker? Is he a dirty old man, a pervert of some type? These have been charges that were leveled against him when he was living and when his work was exhibited near or after his death. Same with Morton Bartlett, Eugene Von Branchenheim, and presumably with the type 42 photographers. These are all artists whose work raises the question of what are the boundaries of acceptable social interaction and its representation through photography. And I do think that that's one of the critical areas that institutions of all sorts have a responsibility to raise and provide a forum for discussion about.
So Joel, maybe again, sort of around these ideas, like, but maybe more specifically with Hujar's work, how do we understand like images of sex and sexuality within his larger body of work?
Sex is a very important subject for Hujar, but I don't want to suggest that it only stands as its own unique subject. I think it's one of several means by which he achieved this intimacy, which is sometimes an intimacy that's not even with an animate object. I mean, I think his photograph of that hallway in the abandoned pier is about a kind of psychological self-portraiture that is meant to be very probing as well. When he was not photographing people in a way that had specifically to do with sex, it was just as often to do with something that profoundly affected the body and the whole being of the person. Pregnancy or old age or infancy or disability or double portraits which are just psychologically charged in a different way. It was about sort of charging that area around the body and the individuality of the subject that made his photography work. And he's somebody who works with the square. He's somebody who's very conscious of making an image that is surrounding in a very even and powerful way, whatever it is he's putting at the center of that frame. And that combined with the kind of implicit one-to-one sort of exchange that sex is about, that to really define his artistic persona, I would say.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions popping up in the question box. So first one for Stephanie, if you want to share those with us.
Thank you, Nelson, and thank you, Brian and Joel, for this really rich discussion. I feel like you took us in so many directions, and we've had a number of questions. And I think that I want to start with one of the more recent ones that we had, which is asking why, if there are any thoughts about why so little of this material is created by women, in terms of what we're terming photo brut or brut photography.
I kind of wonder that sorry, go ahead, Joe.
I would combine it with an observation that Nelson made, which is that this is work of a certain age, a lot of it. And I wonder to what extent work is going to come to light in future that shows us that with changed conditions of photography, as well as changed conditions of just general cultural life of women, it ceases to be as monocultural male preserve as it would appear to be right now. But voyeurism is specific to the subject that we're talking about tonight. I think voyeurism is very often a male-linked type of obsession. Not to overgeneralize.
Brian, before I throw in my 2 cents, I was just wondering, with your vast experience of looking at vernacular photography, so not necessarily, like one of the issues of like the art institution has its own sort of sexist walls and barriers that in some ways that vernacular photography should sort of like go against. Do you find in those collections more work by women that maybe we're just not necessarily seeing?
Absolutely. I think that in vernacular photography, we're talking about, for example, family snapshots, non-professional photography, home folk arts. These are all typical provinces of women from the 19th century to, say, the mid 20th century. These were practices that were encouraged and supported in domestic contexts, but not in professional public contexts. There were relatively few female professional photographers and relatively few professional female art photographers. And the other thing that you mentioned that I think is really important and crucial is the implicit bias of institutions and various other critical apparatuses, grant funding agencies, and all the rest, not only against women, but as you mentioned, against people of color, queer people, and so forth. I mean, these are deep, deep historical biases that have not been eradicated by, recent victories. So there's a long way to go to recover that material, and believe me, it is out there.
And I think I want to build on this with a second question that's just come in, and to note that we have a comment in the chat about one of those rare women professional photographers, Deanne Arbus, who, of course, her work is fantastic and amazing. But this question is, if you could speak to how these self-taught photographers came to be considered artists, that process of how they're entered into this field, which I think is speaking to what you just raised, Brian, of there's still so much more to be discovered. And this question was particularly relating to the Type 42 Polaroids.
Well, what interests me is that process of recognition and canonization of individual artists. I'm much more interested in the social practices and the social contexts in which various kinds of visual images are created and appear, and less interested in the individual makers or the biographies. But as we can see from this exhibition and the functioning of the art market in general, it really relies on the monographic approach, the designation of certain individual photographers, even when the practice is not obvious or evident at first. As Joel mentioned, Vivian Maier was just an unknown photographer whose work was discovered in a storage vault. But then the apparatus of the culture industry worked overtime to try and create a biography and identity around the commodities that her works became.
I think this is really helpful for many of us who are, learning more about this field, who are encountering it maybe for the first time. And I do want to say to everyone who's in our audience tonight, we really invite questions. We have a number here, but we hope that you'll submit more. So we have one question that I think relates back again to your presentation, Brian. If you could just speak very briefly to the afterlife of Morton Bartlett's dolls.
Well, Morton Bartlett's dolls, and I will say similar to the Type 42 photographs, were found at an antique fair And so they were the rudiments of his estate, these 15 individually packed dolls, the 200 plus photographs were acquired by an antique dealer and then dispersed to private collections, museums, and so forth. That's as far as I know about the existence and the history of those dolls.
Thank you.
If I could just throw one little quick tie in there is that Joel, you showed us a photograph that Peter took of Creer LinkedIn, who was an artist herself. And one of the things that she was really well known for was creating these dolls as well too. And then thinking of what we were just saying about where the women in these conversations, like just wanted to point out that she was an artist as well and made these incredible pieces. So.
Thank you, Nelson. That's such a great, I think, you know, just finding the intersections across these very different artists has been really fascinating to hear about tonight and to explore more in this discussion. We have a question here, Joel, relating to Peter Hujar. And the question is whether you feel like people are able to, his models, his subjects, if they were able to explore a more sensual side of themselves through his photography. Did he have a process of making them feel comfortable? I think some interest in the relationship that he had. And you spoke about that at the beginning of your talk in particular.
Yeah, that's a whole novel, but Hujar was a master of silence or of charming, as the need may have dictated. He could sit for very long periods of time without communicating anything particular, if that's what it took for somebody to let down their guard, if they were very chatty or putting up a blind of some kind. I often think of the analogy of a psychiatrist who's just waiting for you to let down your guard and actually get to the work. In thinking about Hujar's photographs, if the seeing the happy public face was not what he was interested in, and sometimes you'll look at 9 contact sheets and realize that he had the shot that he wanted after 3 frames. But of course, we're talking about at the age of the latent image. He's not looking at the back of the camera and seeing what he's got. And so he keeps on going, and has a whole other psychological adventure with that person. And yeah, but it varied entirely by the individuality of the subject.
Wonderful. And Nelson, I'm wondering, does Zach take any photographs himself, or is his work entirely using found imagery?
He recently purchased a camera and is taking photographs himself as well too. He did start more as an illustrator, so it wasn't on found images. It was drawings similar. And then, and I think he says that in about the 80s, when he started getting his first tattoos, he started on himself. He started applying that onto images he's found. But he's working into using his own images as well.
Well, I really love that when we were having conversations about this program tonight, that you brought Zach into the conversation, because I think as we were discussing, his work brings in a different type of desire, and that desire for those connections to elders, to art history. We see that in the way that he's using Peter Hujar's work. And I think that that allows for the conversation to expand in these other ways. So we have just 4 minutes left, and I wanted to also give a chance if you have any questions for one another that remain, or if we have any more pressing conversations from questions, not conversations, from the audience, this would be a great time to ask those. I think we have time for just one more question. Oh, and they're coming in strong. So I'm going to jump in and take back that opportunity for you to ask questions of one another and say, so there's a question here about, I think that, Brian, you were raising questions of pornography, and the question is, why do you think this kind of art was looked down upon and considered pornographic compared to the multiple examples of nude portraits of women in art history? So speaking to, how this image making is different and distinct.
Right. Well, I would have a hard time defining this work as pornographic. I was just loosely using this phrase, homemade pornography, to encompass a wide range of often, humorous or even scatological objects that individuals make or sell at souvenir shops that address unaddressed questions about sexuality and popular culture, right? So I think these the four artists that I mentioned maybe are a little chancier than some in their depiction of sexuality, but from my point of view, it's still pretty tame and really a mark of our relatively conservative attitude towards sex and culture at large, that we find this work disturbing. But I would also put a lot of the onus on the reception of the work. How individual people respond to this work is going to be very different. And so I respect that range of responses and attitudes towards the imagery. And I think that's far more important than whatever intentions the individual photographers may have had in their original usage of these images.
Well, I think, Brian, that's reminding us all of the different ways that we interpret these and what we bring to them is a great place to leave the conversation. I think you've each given us a different lens to approach and consider this work. And I hope that everyone who's here on the call will take this away and go back to see the exhibition in person and reflect on everything that we've discussed tonight. Thank you all for sharing your work so generously and for sharing all of these insights. I do want to say that we do have upcoming programs, including a panel conversation that's a bit in parallel with this, looking at the gaze on April 1st with curators Karen Patterson, Commence, and Sophie Hackett, and our own exhibition curator, Valerie Rousseau, exploring different dimensions of the gaze and the body as a site of gender negotiation, performance, self-expression. So I hope that you'll all join us again for that. And we are also sharing resources for future research for anyone who's interested. That'll be going out in an email this evening. So thank you again, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Very good.